Okay. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I was thinking about one of the provocations. One of the provocations began with something design as an inherently ethical practice, and I was a little confused by that, especially considering some of the discussion that we've had about power in relation to design. I mean, design activities are always occurring within a context, specific institutional context, and impacted by dynamics of power. And one interesting thing about your work to me is that you have worked in a variety of institutional contexts independently on your own, in the academy, in the corporate world, and activist settings. So I was wondering if you could reflect on those different kind of institutional contexts that you've worked in and how power has impacted and constrained or even made possibilities, presented possibilities for your work. I mean, especially in the context of, a major corporation who's obviously interested in pursuing profit and maintaining consumerism, definitely not in the interest of dismantling patriarchy, so how do you negotiate that position, or how do you pursue your design goals within that institutional context, and how does that relate to the work in other contexts, such as the academy, which is obviously also implicated, but I was just hoping you could kind of reflect on power in relation to design.
So probably the basis of the provocation that designing is an ethical practice is as much to try to foment a discussion about ethics among designers. And there are some designers that are very activist designers that are very engaged in these discussions, and then there are many who are not. And so partly I put it on there because what I'm trying to do when I talk to designers is get them to reflect on the cultural implications of their work and say that that's exactly where the profession, this is what the legal profession does, this is what the medical profession does, that's exactly where the profession does things like constitute a professional code of ethics. And so partly that assertion comes out of trying to intervene in a discussion at the level of the profession of designers who belong to lots of different professional organizations, some of which have codes of ethics, some of which you don't, or some of which are governed by other codes like engineering codes of ethics. So that's where that provocation comes from. The power dynamics are so interesting because I've never gone to an institution, let me say, that has been organized in my best interest. And that is certainly true when I was in graduate school, certainly true when I was a young, untenured faculty member, certainly true when I went into the corporation and so on. So the issue of power for me has always come up in every institution, regardless of the genre of the institution. It just takes a different form. So, graduate school would have had one set of power dynamics that was constituted by power differentials between faculty and graduate students, and so on. I was in school at a time when there were no feminist theory courses on the books, so to do feminist theory work at the university level, had significant consequences for me. I got drummed out of a PhD program for wanting to do feminist work, and had to start over a long, long time ago. So in the the place that was supposed to be the most open-minded and so on, I got thumped on the head pretty hard for having a set of commitments that went against the prevailing the prevailing wisdom or the prevailing fashion and so on. That happened again when I went as a young scholar to my first job at Georgia Tech, and all my courses in feminist cultural studies of science and technology were referred to as and sex courses. And every time I would put up a brochure, that was what would get written over it. That was not a very hospitable environment. After I left Georgia Tech, I actually wrote an article called Feminism in the Best of All Places, which is about a kind of a reflection on, it wasn't very hospitable, but it was probably a good place to be. I believe in the power of education, even though you go there kind of knowing that you're going to be at the, you're going to be on the wrong side of the power divide for different reasons. This time I was an adjunct or not an adjunct, a tenure track faculty member, but I was on the wrong side again of a kind of a politics of feminism and so on, even though I'd been hired to teach that stuff. So going to the corporation from a place like Georgia Tech didn't really seem all that different for a couple reasons. One is Xerox PARC is probably one of the most academic kinds of industry research centers. It prides itself in, it calls its people who leave, the alumni, and so on. I mean, it has a really kind of a veneer of the academic. It has a very strained relationship with the corporation. It is famous for letting things walk out the door and not, because the researchers simply don't care. Things aren't stolen from PARC. Things are not so, so blatantly, it's not so espionage. The researchers get bored with the things, and the product people aren't interested in developing it, and so someone who does want to develop it picks up the idea and goes, and next thing you know, you've got the GUI being developed by Apple. So this was a place that was in many respects a much more academic and intellectually hospitable place to be with respect to the micropolitics than my institutional kind of home in the academy where I had gotten tenure. It was less sexist. It was less racist. It was much more egalitarian in the sense of giving me an opportunity to just roll my sleeves up and get started in all kinds of making stuff, of learning tools and so on. So the power there was different than I had experienced in the academy. There was a sense at Georgia Tech, as there is now again, being back at University of Southern California, they were all about making money. That university, Georgia Tech, as is USC now, it's about getting faculty across the disciplines to patent, to get faculty across the disciplines to register innovations for the purposes of building the patent portfolio of the university. So this is not to make an apology for the corporation. I mean, Xerox has got a pretty, it's got there's a famous kind of corporate history about Xerox and so on, and its practices. Mm-hmm.
Design. If you take any presentation, PowerPoint, any of the new presentation tools, they all order design for you in certain sorts of ways. I mean, it gives you a series of choices, right? But ultimately, it's a structure of presentation, right, into which you fit. And so my question is about how it enables and constrains the work that you present through it, right? The order of things, if you want to put it in those terms. So can you just reflect a bit about the relation between what effectively are design tools, right? Designing presentation, designing how we might represent our own work in academic settings in ways different than the formal essay, which has been with us for such a long time, and how one plays with that form and so on. But so it's liberating in one sense, but it's thoroughly constraining in other senses, right? That it places orders upon, it orders you in certain ways. So, I mean, can you just reflect on that and sort of get us into a conversation about the design of research in some sense, right?
So in this case, this piece, one of the affordances, one of the things I like about it in contrast to PowerPoint as a presentation application and a kind of composition application, what I like about this one is it enables a kind of spatialized viewing, and I can put things in space in a way that I can't do easily with PowerPoint. So it's affordance of laying things out spatially. You may not know this. It might not be evident, but there's a spatial semantics to the design, and that spatial semantics is it's not random. There is a kind of a theoretical kind of gloss on it and so on. So this is where I think it starts to enable the enactment of theory in a different way, which is I can now, in the way I lay things out in a kind of spatial array, I can now make other kinds of theoretical points that are not made in language or through the image or through the text itself. So I mean, the semantics of the bracket, right, is everything within here is something. Foucault might ask the first question is what's outside the bracket, right? Such that you have already made it, this again, the cut, right? You've made the cut, this is the bracket. So what's outside the bracket? And we could go on and on, right? Because I've thought about this, the placement of the circles, of what the book is, right? And why I use circles and so on. I mean, it has a kind of semantic logic to me, that makes sense to me that I, could articulate. If it does it hold up over time, I'm not, I mean, that's what a good discussion with a reader would be. So this is an application that that kind of explodes certain limitations of PowerPoint, which up till now has been pretty much PowerPoint or Keynote, which has up till now been pretty much our only two presentation kind of devices. Now, one of the things that's different, like with the vectors pieces, the pieces that are meant to read one-on-one, is you have fewer constraints, because especially, I mean, vectors now having the back-end engine that allows for different kinds of authoring of different kinds of interfaces and so on. So you're going to have, we will see some really interesting experimentation, even as that back end has been structured and has a certain set of constraints built into it. As more people use it, those constraints will be reproduced, and then again, people will start pushing, as all good users do, pushing at the boundaries of what's possible, and they'll kludge something, the workaround, they'll kludge something together, they'll make the system do something that the original designers of the database hadn't imagined it can do. Databases are incredibly powerful for that because of their recombinant DNA, right? Because the elements can be recombined in new ways. Where the politics of databases come in is the way in which metadata and database elements get structured. And that is a meta-authoring that before you've even entered your stuff into that vectors database, a whole set of decisions have been made for you. So you can go down the road into the conversations about where do the constraints kind of happen. That constraint that allows you or allows vectors, authors, designers to produce for things, on a screen is much more enabling than this piece. We have we're missing a whole bunch of technologies about group communication. So our presentation software, so whether PowerPoint, Keynote, and this, I mean, these are the three things that I know. I mean, other than doing master readings of web pages and so on. So I don't know if that's a response, but that's.
We're dueling across the room. I just want to follow on that. I really found your presentation inspiring. Thank you so much for showing us this program. It seemed to me immediately attractive because it broke out of the linearity of what we have with the usual things. I just wanted to ask you to say a few more things along the lines of David's question, because knowing vectors and knowing a little bit now and more about the work that you've done, that vectors and your project have created these really exciting multimedia projects and products now. But when you're maybe in kind of the role of directing multimedia literacy, or to the group here and so many students and people who are deeply concerned with visual materials, how do you tell us to be savvy about better integrating them into work from the outset? Because so many publications are open to, but not entirely embracing the variety and the possibilities. You know, to kind of push some of these possibilities in everyone's own work, to not leave, you know, the photography on the, you know, in the digital form, but get it out and get it in print, or how to integrate it from the digital form with print and other media that get published in the way for credit that everybody needs, especially the graduate students and the new assistant professors. Because what I see happening, I mean, maybe it goes without saying, but what I see happening is some of the students in this position of being so into some of these possibilities, but they're kind of, they want to publish in something online, but it's, you know, it's not refereed or something like this, and you kind of have to pull them out of that a little bit, and unless they're also doing work for which they're also being recognized right at the same time.
Well, I mean, I think in part that project at the broad level is a project that we've been involved with called Haystack, which is it's called Humanities, Arts, Science, Technology Advanced Collaboratory, and this is a virtual organization that is deeply kind of involved in encouraging the development of new digital multimodal literacies across the spectrum and across the disciplines. So not only multimedia literacy, again, in new media learning at the K-12 age, but training the next generation of graduate students in the vernaculars of multiple media. This is where the humanities and humanists being trained in the kind of apprehension of different languages, the languages, whether it's the languages, you know, across kind of natural languages, the languages of cinema, the languages of film, the languages of media, and so on. This is where humanists have a really important role to play in kind of developing kind of pedagogies about how you learn new languages. And, you know, when you talk about integrating images into your scholarship, you know, I mean, we've all seen it done poorly. Actually, scientists are really bad at integrating. I mean, they're an incredibly visual discipline and very, you know, poorly trained in the literacy of the visual image, the dynamic simulation, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, one of the things that we know is that we have to, you know, it's kind of language learning again and again. You have to learn the languages of how images mean, what the semantics of not only the still image, the relationship, the rhetoric of the relationship of the visual to the still, but then the rhetorics of dynamic images, and then the rhetoric of interactivity. And I mean, you can talk about it in terms of multiple rhetorics, you can talk about it in terms of multiple languages, and so on. It doesn't. You know, this is part of the paradigm shift that, you know, I talk about, that there's a generation of scholars who are really committed to it, but not everyone of my generation is really committed to it. A lot of them still believe that this is technological determinism, run amok. They're suspicious, especially at, you know, in the USC context of the digital humanities, when the traditional humanities aren't even funded, you know, so you get those power dynamics happening. But there are some of us who are trying to, you know, to incubate these efforts, you know, to train the next generation of students in these new genres of scholarship, which require them to, you know, to learn new rhetorics and new modes of authoring / designing. Where authoring and designing, I mean, this is the critical thing that you learn about this, and that when you use any application, you know, Word, you know, through a new presentation application, what you can author is, you know, is determined by the affordances of the software. You know, there's a certain line length of characters that looks good, and so on and so forth. As I get more proficient, I hope I learn to work around that. But that's part of what we, at our generation, will be working with our graduate students to learn how to do. It doesn't make their job easier, because like the first generation of really, truly interdisciplinary scholars, they're going to have to do both. They're going to have to still publish in print-based refereed journals as they go and move into new digital domains. Now we did see the University of Maine's new tenure. Was it University of Maine? Put out the new their criteria for tenure that's considering not only scholarly publishing in online journals, digital kind of journals and so on, but are also considering for tenure things like blog postings and participating in online forums, online virtual conferences and so on. So we're starting to see some of the structures of the institution of the academy, partly because I think there are people of my generation who are now getting into positions of power, and they're getting on tenure committees, and they're chairing university-wide tenure committees, and they're starting to push their organizations to be more open about the way in which scholarship and the expressions of scholarship are being changed given the affordances of these new media. So it doesn't make it easier for those students, though, or us catching up.
I have a couple of questions. The first is very simple. Is that this Prezi software, free software or an open software? Okay.
It's just www.prezi.com, and there's a free version, a intermediate version, and then a pro version.
Okay, so it's open software. And the second one is a bit tougher and...
No, this is the pro version because it has a desktop version. I bought it because I didn't know what the status of the internet would be.
And the second question is a bit tougher and engaging, but I would like to have, nonetheless, your opinion. You talked about technoculture before. Now, actually, in few years, technoculture has experienced a dramatic shift. It has its roots in counterculture, then in turn to cyberculture in the 80s and 90s. As this wonderful book by Fred Turner explains, at the end of the day, it turned out to support neocon positions and the Bush administration. So I would like to ask you if you think that there is still some room for critical technoculture, and if yes, under which conditions today?
Well, I mean, there are multiple technocultures, and because these are historically specific cultural formations that that take shape under different conditions and manifest in different ways. The technoculture that I'm investigating now that I think has some it has some possibility is in the U.S. It's called maker culture, and it's a kind of a turn. It's not exactly a turn away from the digital, but it's a turn to embrace the pleasures and the tactility of making things, where the making of things is being heavily encouraged and supported by new social networks that are digitally enabled. So the sharing of instructions for making things, and there's new magazines, Make Magazine and Ready Made, and new websites called Etsy for selling things and so on. It's growing out of the increasing kind of freelance kind of technocultural formation that's showing up in the U.S. and blossoming in the wake of the recession. It's populated by creative freelancers who are scraping to get by and turning kind of to the making of things and using the internet to circulate the making of things. I think there's a path there through that set of cultural practices for something that may more critically or reflectively engage the use of technology as not just the basis for more consumption, but to serve cultural ends of creating communities, making one's living, making ends meet, creating the textures of the pleasures of human existence. artistic expression, cultural connection, social connection.
I have just a reflection and then a question. First of all, about the conversation about USC and the work of being a digital humanist now in the academy. As someone who came through USC and was very excited about the possibilities of multimedia scholarship, and now being an assistant professor, where the reality is where I was hired because I had this added thing, but it really is this added thing. You really have to do both if I want to do this. And this is a big concern in terms of being human, right? Having a life and still being committed to this kind of scholarship. Seriously. But anyway, the question I had was, along the way you were, when you talked about the seeing eye reader along the way, you talked, it might have been a throwaway phrase where you said something like the theory got in the way. There was a lot of theory that got in our way, which immediately made me think about theory versus practice. But then I noticed at the end here, when you were talking about how you interact with this particular, with what is it, Prezi here,
yeah.
you talked about the way it enables certain theorizations. So that makes me think about, I think there's a lot of tension between thinking about, or a whole spectrum of ways of thinking about theory versus practice, theory and practice, the way that practice constrains theory, right? And how do you I'm asking you to theorize your practice a little bit. How do you think about that continuum and how you work in the middle of all of that?
For some reason I want to talk about objects, and because there's a whole way in which the time that I was doing most of my hands-on designing work, and which was really about, there was doing the digital design, but there was a lot of doing just physical work, upholstering things and sawing things and so on, and just making things that were going to be things in the exhibit and so on. There's a way in which the objects were really important theoretical interlocutors for me, that I guess I learned to think differently thinking through these objects, and thinking through the objects, like you think about an object and you think, what's going to make this thing happy? And it'll be happiest if I don't press it to do something it wasn't designed to do. It will be happiest under these conditions. It will be happiest, that you kind of engage in a kind of ventriloquizing with the objects, in which you kind of test out and kind of work through theoretical stuff. At which point I'm working shoulder to shoulder with a couple different people, an engineer and a chip designer and so on, and we're constantly, I'm describing what we're doing using the vocabulary of kind of cultural theory, and they're reflecting back to me an understanding of what I've just said in the terms of the materials of in the engineering terms of the material. So there's a way in which there in the making of objects together, it was this kind of oscillation that happened very quickly in the dialogues of our collaborative designing, where what was getting made was both the object and theoretical understandings. And the object was we talk about it in science studies. It was a boundary object. Lucy Suchman talks about it as an affiliative, as objects as affiliative. And the things we were making were those kinds of objects. It was in the process of making things together. This is one of the provocations that technology is not an object, but objects are important. That in the process of making things together, of literally looking at something in its iterations and so on, not only was the object manifesting, our understanding of the object was manifesting, but my understanding about the kind of meta theoretical scene insight was also being made in that. So a lot was being made there, and this is that kind of that scene of designing that I think is why it looks so interesting for cultural theory. Is there is a way in which designing is about the making of meaning at lots of different levels, simultaneously using different materials language, social intercourse, material objects, things that are not yet objects.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful personal account, but also intellectually stimulating discussion. I've been really enjoying it. One of the things that's really struck me about your presentation is also how you were starting actually with these memories of that project in China 15 years ago, and at the end of your talk you came back to memory and the challenge of memory in a digital age and with technological engagement. And so my question is particular about the intersection of digital media, technological innovation and preservation. So we've been talking a lot about memory over the last couple of days, and to me it seems that technology in particular accentuates that issue of memory and preservation, as Anne, you were saying in the end, because it accelerates it, and there seems to be this notion of immediate forgetting of, today we are seeing this presentation, it's an experience, it's a certain way of seeing images, of interacting with it, and in a year from now we might have completely forgotten that experience. And so exactly because many interactions with technology are so experiential, it is also really hard to preserve them. And I'm thinking in particular about issues sort of in the gaming community, where people talk a lot about that old games 10 years ago have been played on old consoles and cannot be replayed, cannot be re-experienced because those technologies don't work anymore, which is very different in film, I think, because some of these technologies are just so much more interactive, so they cannot be relived by just watching it. They have to be interacted with. And so I was just curious about if you could talk a little bit more about this issue of memory and preservation, perhaps from your own experience, and within your projects, or just general thinkings, perhaps.
Well, I think this is one of those areas that I'm eager to read more and get some help in theorizing this. The tension between memory and forgetting, and how important those two points are kind of in the process of cultural reproduction. There's a science fiction author that I'm very fond of, not because he's a good author or writer, but because of his imaginary. And he's the one who has theorized the singularity, and the singularity is a time when the rate of cultural change happens, the oscillation, right, the rate of cultural change happens so quickly that it just exceeds the human capacity to kind of keep up. And what we're trying to do, of course, is create intelligent agents to keep up for us. It's as if your operating system changed every 5 seconds. Now, you know what happens when you have to change an operating system. Now, what happens in the singularity when that happens every 5 seconds? The only hope we have is to create intelligent agents who will change our operating system every 5 seconds, right? So the issue is, as he says, the major problem in the singularity will not be our operating systems. It won't even be longevity, because we will have solved embodiment and physical longevity. The issue will be human memory. That we are creatures that have limited memory, that our prosthetic memory is just that, right? It's prosthetic. We are bounded. And I don't know what that bound is. And that's what I'd like to, what the bounds of human memory is. Is it 50 years, 30 years? I mean, so I'd like to, that's kind of the speculations I'd like to hear about and delve into. Where I find these discussions really interesting is exactly among those who are talking about what and how are we archiving and preserving digital culture. Oh my goodness, this is so important, so on and so forth. It's, the dominant culture of, the United States. We need to be preserving this. And of course, all their debates are, what does that mean? It means at the level of metadata, do we have interoperable metadata so that everything that gets stored in every computer has some sort of compatible tag so that we can retrieve it at some point? Well, it's also about what is getting stored. So the question about storing the software, preserving and archiving the software, but not archiving the game consoles, so we have the software, but we don't have the machines, starts to get at the kind of complexity of a contemporary technocultural kind of moment where technology isn't just the object, it's also the software. But the minute you start talking about, well, you know, for example, the Computer History Museum was in operation and collecting stuff for 10 years before it realized it forgot to collect software. So then it started collecting software. Okay, and now it has emulations and software and so on, but now it's starting to try to figure out a way to collect the experience of reading on the, so when you have, you know, when you read in a certain way or you have a certain mode of interactivity for the first time, and they don't know how to get at the experiential, they're still only getting at the, and this is now leading a lot of game kind of archivists and historians to think we need, you know, how do you archive processual media? Things in which the meaning of the medium is in the experience of it. That moment of gameplay in World of Warcraft when the guild did this. A profound moment in some notion of social kind of community, but gone, right? Gone forever because there's no way to archive that in a kind of traditional sense. And now they're saying, but we need to archive that. How do we do that? And so I think the questions about memory are also coming from a kind of more instrumental kind of quarter, which is those who are saying, okay, it's not just enough to archive the software and to archive the, you know, to archive the machines or to do web crawls and, you know, support the Internet Archive and so on. There's all this other stuff that, again, goes by the wayside and atrophies because it's not, it's, you know, it costs money to you know, to keep things up on the web. Things are going to disappear because people don't pay their server bills. You know, and so what we get is not just history just belongs to the victors, but history now is only going to be those who keep up with their bills.
It actually follows up on this. It's also a question about the experiential and about the remarks you made about new forms of embodiment and sociality. I'm also interested in this in the context of emergent forms of subjectivity. Now, interestingly, when you gave us examples about the new forms of embodiment, you talked about the fantasized forms of embodiment on Second Life. I'm also interested in especially how these fantasized forms of embodiment don't only relate to material forms of embodiment, but how they impact forms of embodiment. What happens to, you know, we talked a lot about touch, about mirroring. What happens to touch and mirroring? What happens, especially the most dramatic change, I think, has to do with the face-to-face. And there's the whole ethical dimension involved there about the ethics of the face-to-face versus a very different sociality and interrelationality. And I think that we can't underestimate the impact these fantasized forms of embodiment have. I think they really have material impacts that go beyond just atrophying organs because we sit so long at the computer. I thought, for example, about the I was totally stunned by the research that came out about this exhibition Bodyworks and how it has generated people. Nothing has gotten people to exercise as much as when they went to that exhibition and saw the inside of, you know, how the muscles look from the inside instead of, you know, no photos of the old bodybuilding males has gotten people to do this. But suddenly you see your muscles from the inside and you see people who die because they haven't exercised. I never thought that an exhibition would create that kind of material effect. Now I think other forms of very subliminal effects are in place with these fantasized forms of embodiment, but also with fantasized forms of sociality and relationality. They feed back and impact us, but not, I don't think, in a one-to-one relationship. And this is something I have tried to find if there's work on this, and I can't find anything on these kind of dynamics.
Mark Meadows has a book on, it's called I Avatar, and it's trying to get at that, trying to kind of theorize that, that I guess the cognitive shifts of living most of your life, or daily life, through avatars. You know, in some respects, I kind of think the question of the material body and the relationship of avatars, fantasy, and the material body is kind of one of these questions that in 5 years is going to be a non-question in the way we're posing it now. Because within 5 years, we're going to be wearing our computers, and those fantasies are going to be the clothes that I put on. So I will have flicker cladding, and I will look to you like I have wings, because the glasses or the implants you have will see my wings, because you and I are in a social network that allows you to see the avatar I want you to see.
Your office in the sky.
Right. So, you know, I think the turn we're at is both ubiquitous computing, where our bodies are not going to be in this relationship, that our bodies are going to be in our, you know, our kind of space, and our areas around us are going to be interactive and dynamic and sense-based and so on. Our bodies, what we wear, are going to be augmented in ways that we literally wear our fantasies. So instead of projecting ourselves onto a fantasy figure, we will be, you know, it's kind of, you know, ritual scarification, tattooing, makeup, cosmetic surgery, flicker cladding. They will all be technologies that enable us to perform our identities in different ways. So in some respects, I think the question is, in 5 years, the question's going to be formed differently again. Thank you.